Hello, welcome back to the Young Justice Podcast. This is Zach Rhoads. Today I will share with you part 2 of my talk with psychologist, author, and addiction expert Stanton Peele. In just a moment, I will set the stage for that discussion. First, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Not long. Many people are tuning in to each episode of this show. That number is now reliably in the thousands. I am so grateful that people are tuning in from all over. Thank you. The show started out as just a few hundred listeners nested in my state of Vermont, and now the listenership has grown substantially in numbers and is much wider spread, as Vermont residents now make up only 20% of my listenership, and this is something I did not anticipate. I intend to keep this show going for quite some time. I'm certainly at no loss for interesting people to interview, but I do want to ask for your help. If you enjoy listening to the podcast and are interested in seeing it grow, you can help. You might simply write a review on your podcast app or on the Blog Talk Radio site. There is a strong correlation between number of reviews and number of listeners. I get a lot of email and Facebook private messages, which is awesome, but it would be helpful if some of those people were willing to share their messages publicly. Another way you could help is by sharing the episodes of the show to like-minded folks or anybody you think might be interested on this content on human development and addiction. And then lastly, I plan to start a Patreon account. Patreon, for those who don't know, is a site you can go to promote your show, and which I will do, and ask for donations that can either be one-time or monthly, and I will give rewards for different tiers of donation. Because this project has become so involved, it includes paying for the domain on the podcasting website. I'm doing endless research, which is awesome. That is in my purview, and I love doing it. But what it does is take a lot of time away from other more lucrative things I could be doing. And I don't intend to stop doing this, but it would make things feel a whole lot more manageable if this project turned into a cash positive one. So I will be working on creating a Patreon account in the coming weeks, offering rewards to different tiers of contributions. If you have done this before, or or have any ideas about what seem like appropriate rewards for each type of donation, please let me know. Again, either by emailing me, you can find me on Facebook or Twitter, or writing in the comment section, all of which I posted how to do in a description of this talk. Okay, I'm glad I got that off my chest. Last week you heard from Stanton Peele, who spoke about our insidious rise in drug deaths. Look, the point he's trying to make is that we're somehow unwilling to face what should be obvious ways to address this problem, both in the interest of harm reduction and also understanding the foundations of addiction itself. And he made a strong point, and it gave me chills to hear, but it was quite powerful. He said, "It's as if we don't care if people die." He's right. Now, I think we do care about people dying, but we act as if we don't. We are led by this idea that people with addiction are diseased and that the cause of drug deaths are doctors prescribing too many drugs or the drugs themselves, and we spend our time continuing to throw efforts at these ideas and will simply not relent. All the while, we know in other contexts what addiction really is. We've seen it a million times, and we recognize it in relevant contexts of life, including our own. But we don't recognize it anymore when we hear politicians, and police officers, and disease theorists talk about it on the media. And Stanton's right. We are supposed to believe this theory of addiction, which is all the things we already know about addiction, but in drag. It's now unrecognizable. It makes people feel confused and powerless. So today, though, you'll hear Stanton's ideas about MAT, medication-assisted treatment. Now, he and I have had many back-and-forth exchanges about this. If you don't take the time to listen carefully, maybe even if you do, it's going to sound like he's against methadone and against buprenorphine. But that is not true. He is not against either of these. But do take note, he's stated many times that drugs are not the problem with respect to addiction. And now, all he's saying is that they're not the solution either. I have pushed back on these ideas of his, and I circulated his ideas around a small group of other experts that I've had on the show before because I was confused. And it's because MAT, with methadone, Suboxone, By the way, not Vivitrol or naltrexone. That's kind of another category. But MAT with methadone Suboxone has proven to cut death rates by half or more. And this is shown by about 5 decades of research. You can look it up yourself. One reliable source is NCBI data. If you just type in NCBI, MAT, yeah, you'll find it. Why would he be against this? He'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but actually what I've gathered from his statements here are that he's all for MAT, and it's okay as harm reduction. It's okay for people to get a stable, consistent dose of something, raise their tolerance, and cut risk of death. You would have to be an absolute maniac to disagree with that. But the crux of his argument is very nuanced. It is that he doesn't want to see experts that he appreciates and respects now become complacent with the idea that medications can actually act as therapy. Kind of the way culture has become complacent with the idea that addiction is a disease that's biological and that it can be treated with medicine. There is this idea that when you treat somebody with medicine, that they're medically sick and need to get better. And this is how they start feeling about themselves. So we should avoid that whenever we can. We need to make sure that the message to people is that they are using drugs to feel preferred sensations and avoid unpleasant ones, and that's understood. We need to honor that. They're not actually crazy for wanting to use drugs. They're obviously getting something out of it. And they do have their benefits, or else they wouldn't be doing them. We need to assess the risk involved with use with each person, figure out what each person wants out of life, and guide them to achieving and maintaining the values, connections, motivations, and resources that will allow them to live productively and fulfillingly and without this addictive experience, compulsive drug use despite negative consequences. So look, I'm a huge proponent of MAT. I'm in full agreement with Stanton that if we apply medication assistance and our already incorrect framing of addiction, there is the potential of doing more harm than good. So you can both be a proponent of MAT, in favor of it, and understand that there's the potential of doing more harm than good. So I'm going to shut up now. I'll let him put his argument much more eloquently. Please enjoy part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Stanton Peele.
In the medicalization of addiction, the biology of addiction, that we ignored the clearest way to save people's lives, and nobody has paid a price for that. Not Christine Whitman. Nobody who ever was against that crazy drug czar of the Clintons. Nobody has ever paid any price for that. Because, I'll say it again, we don't really care if people die. We just don't want to upset our apple cart. And if you believe that model, then you'll understand why we're continuing to pursue the same approaches that have led to more and more deaths. No research shows, so here's the situation you face. Buprenorphine, which Philip Seymour Hoffman had a prescription for buprenorphine. Anna Nicole Smith and her son both died, by the way, taking methadone. They had giant storage. They had giant containers of it, but they weren't taking it under supervision. The problem is those things. You don't die if you're in a methadone program. You don't die in the methadone program, just the same way you don't die in a heroin program. When you die is when you say, I just don't like methadone by itself, that I'm going to double up with some other substance. Methadone doesn't do it for me like heroin does. Or you stop taking your methadone or your buprenorphine, and then you're back where those people with the nicotine patches are. What happens next when you've decided that the only way you can abstain from drugs or heroin, and you're not abstaining from them, is by having this drug replacement? It's not anything like it's a misnomer to call medicine-assisted treatment. And you started this question very well. It's a harm reduction technique. And as a harm reduction technique, you can't disdain it. You can't put it down. You have to welcome it. It prevents people from dying. But to the extent that unsupervised drug use and drug addiction are highly toxic activities, it does nothing to address or remedy those things.
I want to make sure I'm putting your argument precisely. Now, we're talking about when you started saying safe injection sites or HAT sites, where at those places, nobody's infested with a disease model. What they have is an environment where people are talking about how to make progress, how people have made progress in the past, and maybe...
Well, I won't go that far. I actually went and lectured. Canada is going whole hog now into safe injection sites.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to spread them all over the country. It's become a national mandate due to a Supreme Court decision. Previously in Vancouver, there was a safe injection site called Insight, and there was a heroin provision site. I wouldn't say that they didn't follow the medical model. Liz Smith invited me up to speak at Insight. She herself is not a medically oriented person, but she herself is not, or she doesn't think about what causes, her gut feeling. The whole program was providing, giving people, it's called the Portland Hotel Society,
Mm-hmm.
and what it provided housing for people. Liz was a genius. I'm sorry, it's Liz Evans is her name. She provided jobs. She developed a bakery. She developed restaurants. She's just like a one-woman wonder. She lives in New York City now. I ran into her at Ethan Edelman's retirement party. I didn't know she was in town. And she's propagating for safe injection sites. But many of the people, when I went there, I was stunned to find that many of the people there, they had AA members who were proposing the disease model. I think Liz Evans sneakily doesn't like that and wanted me to go against it because it's not her gig to argue with people about things like that. She's busy putting up hotels and residences. And there were definitely people there who were gung-ho with my point of view, and there were others who weren't. And so it's not the philosophy behind those sites. That's a separate issue. The existence of the site itself is a positive thing. Of course, I would go along with your inclination to make sure that those sites encouraged THS, Portland Hotel Society. They provided people with a life, a place to live, a community, jobs, work, and respect. I saw Liz interact with the people in the residences. She has a gift for dealing with people with respect, a gift. And those are the elements that enable people to overcome addiction or make as good headway as they can with regards to addiction.
Why wouldn't we be able...
If they're getting pure drugs or they're injecting it in a safe place, they don't die in the meantime.
Right. Now, why wouldn't we be able to do the same thing just in the framework of having methadone or buprenorphine, maybe even in addition to having a safe heroin injection site?
Well, okay, that's a really good point. You're putting me on my P's and Q's. Why develop a replacement for heroin that gives only the inexact effect of heroin and that many people reject because of that? Instead of giving them heroin when you can get the same beneficial result from giving them heroin.
Right.
Why don't we do that? And the answer to that is because heroin. If you say heroin, Americans just hit the roof. It's like that. If you ever that movie Tombs, where Roger Rabbit just hits the roof and crashes through to the next floor. The question is, what is the easiest, most appealing way to get people to take drugs on a regulated, safe basis? It's to give them the drug that they're already taking and want and like, for want of a better word, the drug they prefer. Give it to them in a safe environment. Help them to create the accoutrements of a good life. tell them they can quit the drug, which, by the way, methadone programs, I shouldn't tell a story like this out of school, but what the hell. At Ethan's farewell party, I ran into Bob Newman. Bob Newman is Mr. Methadone. I actually won a career award from the Drug Policy Alliance, which is the organization that Ethan headed, the same year that Bob Newman did. And we were in line at, they had a buffet or something like that. And I go, Bob. And Bob looks at me blankly and says, oh, I know I should know who you are, but I don't. I said, oh, I'm nobody, Bob. You don't have to pay any attention to me whatsoever. But I've actually had these arguments with Bob. He doesn't know who I am. Why would he? Bob Newman tells people, the methadone people tell people, you have a metabolic disease that they sell the disease model. Dolan Nicewinder sold the metabolic disease model, telling people you can't get off of methadone. So you'll always run into people. I used to answer questions off my website, PeelNet, and people would say, I want to get off methadone, and they say, I can't get off methadone. To me, telling somebody you can't get off of an addiction, a drug, it's a sin against mankind and nature and God.
What about places that will say that they would like you to taper off and they figure out a plan with you? Is that better than no?
That's what you have to do. And methadone comes with the Dolan Nicewinder packaging concept that you have they have metabolic disease, not brain disease.
Right.
And of course, we have the brain disease with heroin. Everything should be done away with the disease model. Everybody should be told, well, look, you obviously want to take heroin. You've been taking it before you came to us to give it to you. And we'll give you pure heroin. We want you to stay alive. And we want you to know that you can quit. We're not going to harass you, but we want to encourage you to quit or to change your drug to something, like marijuana. We have staff here who have done that. You can talk to them freely at any time. And you're taking a first step here towards taking care of yourself and making progress in your life. This is step one. Clean needles, step one. Coming to this facility, step one. And the next step is, maybe you want to improve your education or address some other health issue. Maya and I, Salovitz and I both appear on a video that was made by Ken Anderson for the Lower East Side Harm Reduction Center. Maya's contribution is the best thing I ever saw her do. She does her section where she says, well, I've run into people at the center who say, I've never known anybody who really cared whether I lived or died before.
Mm.
And now when I met people who care that I live or die, the mean streets of drug addiction, the worst thing about it aren't the drugs. You just don't run into that upscale crowd that could help you in life is the main problem. And once they thought that my worth was worth saving, that I was a person who deserved to be alive, that was kind of an incredibly motivating thing for me. So, any one of these maintenance programs is the beginning, conceivably, of a process of self-respect, a process of learning, a process of feeling strong about yourself. And if it's seen in that regard, as opposed to a maintenance program, Bob's your uncle, that's what you're involved in. You should never argue against that, even at the same time that, you can't harass people into wanting to improve. I'll give you one more example. I began this by talking about reductionism. I'm pretty old. Two guys came up at the same time as me, were kind of doyens in the addiction and the alcoholism field. They're known as more alcoholic kind of guys. One of them, Alan Marlett, I think he died in 2013, and Bill Miller's sort of retired, who developed motivational interviewing. Alan Marlett did relapse prevention and harm reduction psychotherapy. Neither of them to my knowledge or memory, ever described any of their research in brain terms. They didn't say, oh, relapse prevention, look, it activates your frontal cortex. Bill Miller, I'm never aware, has ever said, oh, look, motivational interviewing, look, it lights up this part of your brain that's so good for you.
Mm-hmm.
They just did psychology for psychology. But Alan Marnock participated in something in Seattle called wet housing, where they researched alcoholics on the street. You know, the Skid Row originally was from Seattle. They're a bad proposition. They mess up the neighborhood. They are often in hospitals or prisons because something has to be done with them, especially if it's cold or temperate night. And so they came, Seattle, the same place that might be the first place in the United States to do a heroin injection site, developed a wet housing program. And the wet housing program had the simple proposition of getting people off the street so that they didn't bother anybody else and that they would be safe and warm themselves. In the first 6 months of the program, and so there was no therapy other than, you know, we don't want you to die and we want you to have some degree of self-respect. You come here and drink as much, you can drink as much as you want in your room. In the first 6 months, they reduced their drinking from an average of 18 drinks daily to 12 drinks daily. The therapy was self-respect, and of course there's still, 12 drinks daily, you're not a moderate drinker. On the other hand, it's better to drink 12 drinks than 18 drinks a day. And, you're sort of headed in the right direction. And the therapy was simply having a safe, warm place and some feeling of self-respect, and you're respected by other human beings. That's the therapy.
So I've got two things for you. One is a reality, and one's a hypothetical. Well, one, insofar as we don't have heroin maintenance, is methadone and buprenorphine the best that we have, or would it be better not to have them? Or would it just be best to have them if that's what people want, but also be offering next steps?
Well, my job isn't to be practical. My job is to say the truth. So I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, obviously, it would be cruel and inhumane to close methadone clinics, A, people, and B, to prevent giving people buprenorphine prescriptions. I can't, I couldn't, who could do that? On the other hand, to say, these aren't really treatments for addiction. People need to know while they're taking these drugs that in a way, in a sense, they're still addicted and they could be unaddicted. That's a possibility. And here are some ways to proceed to do that. And to recognize that we might as well have an active heroin maintenance program, which, as I said, Liz Evans is now traveling around the United States telling people that. God bless Liz Evans. That's my job, to tell people those things. To argue against Bob Newman, which I can do incognito because he'll never remember me, by saying, telling people that they have a metabolic disease that they can never cure or overcome is a sin against mankind. To give the methadone with that message is there's a Yiddish term, it's a bane. It's a shanda, they call it in Yiddish. So I would eliminate that, but, I wouldn't throw out prescribing buprenorphine or having methadone clinics. I would, but let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Why are drug deaths accelerating now? A. B. Why is Seattle all of a sudden doing allowing people to do heroin maintenance sites? Why is Liz Evans in such demand now? Let me ask you that question. Why do you think all of a sudden, given that we have a fairly active methadone program nationally, given that buprenorphine has definitely been accepted, given that all of these programs, all cops now even know about MAT, how come there's such a surge in interest in HAT, do you think?
I think where you might be going is the fact that, yes, there is MAT, and in subsets, it certainly, I mean, the NCBI data is pretty clear. It certainly cuts death rate. I don't think it's usually any less than 50% in a given population. But at the same time as these are being implemented more, death rates are skyrocketing, probably a lot to do with mixed sedatives and synthetic opioids.
So in other words, a certain number of people are paying attention to the failures that we're facing. How much can you congratulate people? I mentioned to you seeing a rather striking thing, All In with Chris Hayes. He's a typical liberal moderator on MSNBC, which means that he endorses disease theory. No matter how smart you are and liberal, you're obligated to say, oh, I believe it's a disease that affects anybody. And then you might say, I don't know where. Well, I actually know where Chris Hayes lives. He lived in my neighborhood, the same neighborhood the mayor lived in, which is Park Slope. Are there many heroin addicts that you see on the streets of Park Slope? Do you really feel that just as many people are addicted to narcotics in Park Slope, which is a way upscale Brooklyn neighborhood, as there are in the rural areas of New Hampshire and Maine and in Appalachia? Do you really believe that? And you're sort of obligated to sort of say yes, but they hide it better. And then you sort of say, well, if you mean by hiding it better that you lead a normal life, that you go to the doctor, that you don't die, that you're healthy, that if you're a kid, you go to college, is that what you mean by they handle it better? Because that's getting pretty close to saying they're not addicted in the same way, and they're certainly not as likely to die in the same way. And he interviewed Maggie Hassan, the senator from New Hampshire, and I was shocked because she was bragging about all the MAT-type medical programs they were using. And this is before the New York Times article came out. Chris Hayes actually said to her, but aren't drug deaths still accelerating?
Right, yeah.
And she kind of fell all over herself. And this is the perfect paradigm. And maybe, we're coming to a close dealing with this. It's almost like, remember when I said people don't actually care? Remember Christine Whitman? They don't really care if people die. All those AA and abstinence people who refused, they were the main people who blocked needle exchanges. They don't really care if people die. Maggie Hassan wants to, God bless her, wants to be seen as somebody who's doing the right thing. First of all, she has to get elected. Second of all, her self-image is, well, I'm a progressive, modern person. This is a modern technique. And when somebody throws a little bit of a flinker a fly in the ointment and says, death rates are accelerating, they're not getting better, are you sure that what you're doing is really working? And then they could cite the kinds of things that Maya cites. Well, look at the research. It says it should work. By the way, clinical research shows that nicotine replacement therapy works. It works. A clinical trial is something that takes place in a couple of months, where you give people nicotine replacement and they find it easier to quit smoking. So if you look at it in that context, people will say, well, NRT is proven effective. If you say, well, let's take a group of human beings and look at them over 3 to 7 years, what's the best way for them to quit smoking? It's not effective. And so, why people are still, obviously people are driven to consider HAT because of the abject failure of what we're doing right now. I can't tell you how surprised I was to see Liz Evans. As I said, Liz had me up to Vancouver. I met her originally in Liverpool. I didn't get around that much, but, I'm going to drop some names. And then I bumped into her at Ethan Nadelman's farewell party, the same one place I ran into Bob Newman. And she's in the United States. She lives in New York now. And she's now promoting heroin injection sites here in the United States. She's kind of a necessary thing in our history of dealing with drugs. And the only thing I can tell you, though, is this. There is not one heroin maintenance site in the United States of America. There's an active program nationwide in Canada. There are thousands around the world. It's so reminiscent of the fact that we were the last country in the Western world to have needle exchanges. It's almost as though we're saying, and of course, you know, Trump, that imbecile, has appointed a new addiction commission, and it's headed by that other imbecile, Chris Christie. By the way, living in New Jersey, Chris Christie was the governor of New Jersey after Christine Whitman, and, you know, two governors after him. So I got to witness them all. What are they? You think they're going to come up with a heroin maintenance program? You think that's a suggestion they're going to come up with?
Considering the presidential commission I just witnessed, no.
That's what I'm referring to. The presidential commission is the one that Chris Christie's involved with, and you know, Trump doesn't care.
No.
If people in inner city Baltimore and Appalachia and rural New Hampshire and Maine die, he doesn't care. And the ironic, here's the crazy thing, that this is the scary, addictive part. And, you know, we could end on this. And people point this out. For the first time in modern public health history, a group of human beings' lifespan is declining. That group of people, it's not white people, it's white people without a college education.
Mm.
And and they call them deaths of despair because three of the leading causes are liver disease, which is alcohol-related, suicide, and drug-related deaths. That's happening now, and those people vote for Trump, and Trump couldn't give less of a shit about them. And yet they'll vote. West Virginia voted incredibly. They're the state that's most reliant on federal assistance for drug programs. Kentucky is the state that's most reliant on Obamacare. They voted overwhelmingly for Trump. Talk about addiction. People are saying, we have a life of despair. We feel we're not acknowledged. We feel we don't have any options in life. We feel that regular people are looking down on us, Democrats that they didn't vote for, Hillary Clinton and her ilk. And so we voted as a kind of a symbolic existential gesture for Donald Trump. And then people say, that's crazy. They're voting to kill their own opportunities for health care by voting for Trump. And that just goes to show you how powerful these emotive votes are.
You know what's interesting is that somebody like Trump, I'm going to agree with you that he doesn't care. The death rates, I really don't think he cares. I do think that there's a spectrum where at the top there are people who truly do care and truly who do want to do the right thing. And despite everything you've pointed out, which is not controversial, there is just a level of dissonance and wanting to hang on to a cultural meme that they will not admit the truth, don't you think?
Yes. And people have been writing books now. I mean, there's the upper 1/2 of 1% who run the country. Okay, forget that. There's the upper 20%, and conceivably you and I, we're on the fringes of it, but conceivably you and I, Zach, are in that 20%. Mm-hmm. I know you don't have children. I have 3 children. They all went to colleges. Some of them are pretty expensive colleges and things like that. The upper 20%, they care no more. And with all due respect, I would put Hillary Clinton and Maggie Hassan in that. They don't know people who live in inner city Baltimore. They have no idea. Chris Hayes, you know, I know the neighborhood he lives in. He goes to the Y that I go to and the mayor goes to. They don't perceive what hopeless lives look like. And they want their kids, like I wanted my kids to get a college education to do well. We have all these advantages, and we're as cut off from that group of people as Donald Trump is. And so it's almost like they're thinking, well, are we going to vote for a Democrat who doesn't care about us and puts us down, or vote for Donald Trump who doesn't care about us, but at least he talks us up? Right. He calls us real Americans.
The reason I mention it...
my honest belief is we have a social system that's just not predicated on the concept of community-based values of trying to help people.
Right.
So except for you, Zach, because I know you deal with people, you deal with, I mean, why I love Liz Evans, you know, Liz Evans' father was a prominent physician in Toronto. And Liz Evans, for some reason, thought that what she should do is to work among people with the worst. It's not that they even had a drug problem. They very often had severe mental illnesses. Their backgrounds, you know, of course, this is the group that Gabor Mate worked with. They had trauma. I hope this doesn't sound too silly or careless. Up the wazoo. I mean, they didn't have a divorced family. They had total lives that were completely disorganized growing up. They had no real home life or community life or social life or any or chance in life. And I know that you work with children. You know, I mean, you work with anybody who comes to school you work with, but some of the children you work with come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there are people that pay attention to them. But our society isn't geared towards, our politicians aren't geared towards, our voting isn't geared towards addressing those issues. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to rebuild communities. We don't know how to rebuild inner city Baltimore. We've been trying for decades. We don't know how to rebuild Appalachia. That's what Robert Kennedy went to Appalachia and started crying when he saw kids being brought up in that poverty. That we don't know how to do. We do know sometimes how to help individuals and families, but we don't know how to build communities and resurrect sections of the United States that just have plummeted through the basement. And until we do that, which we may not be able to do, which we may not have the motivation to do, which we may not care to do, we'll never, ever, ever lick our alcohol use disorders, our drug deaths, our lowering life rate among the disadvantaged whites and African Americans that we're now being struck with and that we're flailing at with like palm leaves, magical palm leaves of let's give the medicine.
Just a couple things and then we're good. But so for the subset of people for whom the life circumstances, like you were talking about, who Gabor Mate works with, on the level that they're so adverse and severe that they will certainly need more time than most to start living an addiction-free life, maybe even if they ever do, you would say, right, that providing the maintenance, even if it's something like methadone, buprenorphine, yes, it's going to cut the death rate, and you'd have to be a monster not to. But actually what you're saying is that while we should do that, given an immediate circumstance, we need to be thinking quite a lot broader and talking about how to
remember now, the Portland Hotel Society, where Gabor Mate was the medical director, had insight. So you know, you're coming up. I mean, in the United States, people can say, "Oh, Stanton's coming up with these." What the hell is Peele's? What's he know? He's making up things that don't exist. But in Vancouver, what you're describing exists, and now it's spreading throughout the country. Canada is now committed to a national program of heroin administration sites. Because, I mean, it was nip and tuck there. I mean, Liz has some problems. She lost that position for one reason or another, some administrative snafus. But she had to fight constantly to maintain it. Although now, for some reason, it was a Supreme Court decision, but I hardly believe that really caused it. Canada is now committed to a national program of heroin maintenance, of heroin administration. But the other thing I want to point out, when you bring up trauma, I mean, this is a whole other discussion for another day. You and I have also been discussing the fact that the man who was known for learned helplessness, Martin Seligman, has now turned to positive psychology. And for the last 5 years, he's had a perspective psychology program at Penn. Maybe this is coming my last brilliant point. Decades of data have shown that people regularly overcome trauma. When something happens, like a place burns down, like happened in London, or when there's a series of deaths or shootings, we rush in psychologists. Everybody knows you're supposed to do that. There's not one piece of research that shows that that's useful. Not one piece of research shows that has a positive effect. But everybody's for it. I hate to get down on Maggie Hassan, but she has to be for it. Everybody's for it. President Obama's for it. President Trump's for it. Not one piece of psychological research has ever shown it's been beneficial. And here's the 3 reasons why that's true. People's own coping mechanisms are often quite adequate for that. 2, facing adversity, especially facing adversity as a part of a community, has in fact tremendously beneficial effects. Community organizing itself, as opposed to having outside experts coming in and telling them how they have to be traumatized, those are 2 different things. They'll overcome the trauma on their own, and the community will reorient possibly as a positive force. Those are 2 things. What Seligman is pointing out is the theories that emphasize the devastating effects of trauma or genetic birth problems are counterproductive because human beings are characterized by the ability to reformulate their own histories. And Gabor Mate, I don't want to mention the name too much here, people will think I'm getting down on him, and psychoanalysis have the idea of recreating your trauma as being a cure. In fact, the fact that people forget, understate, realign, reframe those things naturally is a natural tendency of the human mind, which is beneficial and therapeutic. Seligman points out, people don't have good memories or good big brains to remember the bad things that happen to them. They have big brains and good cognitive capabilities to formulate better paths forward. And in the volume they created, they say that's a socio-biological trait of human beings. They've always had this characteristic. It's what defines us relative to other animals. But you can take it one step further and say they should be arguing forcefully against the disease model and the trauma model, which is they do subterraneously. Martin Seligman's not going to get in a fight with Gabor Mate. He's got a prestigious, position at Penn. They get money for this program. But you have to confront, they're talking about a prospective, positive psychological outlook, which is the best thing to help people. But the only way we're going to institute that is to fight the constant emphasis on genetics and trauma, which now pervades our society, which we have to overcome before we can do a prospective psychological approach to problem, to addiction, to mental health, to trauma, to whatever problems people have been born with in the first place. That always makes the most sense. Remember the person who says, well, somebody cares that I lived or died when they gave me a clean needle. Or the street alcoholics who started drinking less when they had some self-respect and a place to live. It's amazing how resilient human beings are, even people that look to be at the very bottom of the curve. And, that's why, I hope, Liz Evans is resurrected in the United States, I hope, as the phoenix for our time.
You think quite sensibly. I mean, what if I created a community right now from scratch where we were honest about the fact that we are future-seeking creatures and we did what was in the best interest of everybody in their life experiences, allowing them to get momentum, move forward, and then fill in the gaps with things that they don't have, and quite sensibly have safe injection sites, places that people can get pure heroin, like what you're saying, mixed with a decriminalization of drugs. And that can even include MAT with methadone and buprenorphine. Would there be anything missing from that society in terms of addressing our drug issues?
Well, only the loss of community and the larger societal problems. I mean, the very best drug policy still only gets a quarter of the pie or less, an eighth of the pie. You and I know something else you've been paying attention to is Sebastian Junger has been writing about post-traumatic stress.
Yeah, he's great.
He points out people who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress are not necessarily those who have been in combat or had the worst combat experiences. What they tend to have is the worst community experiences, both in terms of where they didn't fit into the community where they were fighting, and they didn't return to an integrated community. That PTSD, which is defined as the medical problem, is actually a community problem. And he goes back anthropologically and historically to people coming back from battles at different times. And the strength of the communities to which they returned is the overwhelming determinant of how well they recuperate from their war wounds, psychological or otherwise. Then that raises, it's a brilliant analysis. He's a brilliant man. He's right. It raises the question of, if you don't have a strong community, how do you get a strong community? How do you create that? How do you recreate that? And there are people who work on that. There are people who know that. There are people who do research on that. But that goes beyond the scope of, that's not exactly addiction treatment. And I'm not, Bruce Alexander's an old and good friend of mine. He's a person who goes totally over to the level of saying, forget addiction treatment. We have to organize society in a fair way, which, is a kind of socialistic model in order to overcome addiction. I know Bruce lives that way. I mean, I know Bruce doesn't lord, his lifestyle over other people. When I'm in Canada, when I'm in Vancouver fighting with the Gabor on the one hand, I walk around Stanley Park with Bruce on the other, and we buy, street ices from vendors, and we get a beer at a hotel, for $6. I mean, I know he's a man of the people, but that's a step too far for me as an addiction expert, in the sense that I believe that's important. I believe people need to do that work. But I don't know that what I know about addiction, I think it feeds into that issue, but I don't know that I know how to do that, or I've demonstrated some great ability at doing that. And I don't know that Bruce has. Writing a big book about, the need to de-addictionize society, to make it more fair, to make it more socialistic, that's a different enterprise from going out among the people and creating a political entity that does that. I think having heroin maintenance sites does do that to some extent. I think selling to people, destigmatizing addiction and heroin, I think has some contribution to that. Heroin addicts aren't people who aren't subhuman beings. They're people that they have a life, they have a contribution to make. The same with those wet housing, street alcoholics. And the same with the population that in Vancouver at the Portland Hotel Society. They're human beings. You should meet them sometime. You should deal with them. They may have problems, but they're people that you can respond to as human beings. And so in this larger social picture, which is a tough problem that people are having a hard time coming to grips with around the world, I do think that drug policy, destigmatization of drug addiction, destigmatization of drugs is a critical element in it. Saying to people, well, some people take drugs, but, some people do other things. People hurt themselves in a variety of ways. Let's just try and get in step going forward to give people the best chance for fulfilling their lives. So all of these New York Times articles, Chris Christie talking about his friend dying in a hotel room, to me, that's not what it's about. What it's about is saying, well, look, this woman or this man wants to be with their children just as much as anybody else. You can understand that, can't you? How can we help them to do that? So let me just give you one practical technique. I know I did a recent therapy or involvement with a woman whose husband had a drug issue. And in the course of our relationship, the reason she came to me for that problem was because she had a daughter who had gotten heavily involved in pain pills. And her and her husband, they were high-level professionals, had sent her to rehab 6 times. And finally they said to her, look, we're not going to send you to rehab anymore. And of course, she was just getting 12-step bullshit. We're going to tell you it's your responsibility. We're going to tell you we're going to help you as much as possible. We're going to help you by allowing you to do positive things like going to college. Whenever you're clean, you're perfectly welcome to come home, to have dinner with us at any time. We hold out the olive branch of love to you, but we're going to give you every support in doing this, but we're going to allow you to make that choice and realize that it's your choice to make. Of course, this woman was in her 20s, and she came from a well-off family, so she had every kind of an advantage. But that's an example of how destigmatizing drugs, destigmatizing addiction, relying on laws and family and community are fundamental answers for any kind of addiction program.
Well, Stanton, let's plant a flag there, because next month, as I will have said in the introduction, we're going to be speaking with Pat Denning and Janine Little. Of course, mostly about their book, but I think that we might get into sort of the social factors embodying addiction later on. But before we take off, will you direct my listeners to your work so they can learn more about you and more about the issues we talked about today? I'm sure people will be interested.
Well, I mean, I have a life process program online, and I think people have a pretty good idea of how I focus on dealing with addiction, or, I mean, I don't even want to call it addiction. It's a online program which also has phone and Skype connections between clients and coaches. It's about approaching addiction type issues the way that I talk about. My most recent book is Recover, Stop Thinking Like an Addict, which I wrote with a wonderful woman named Ilsa Thompson, which she has a very strong Buddhist orientation. And the concept is the most important element in overcoming addiction is rethinking your relationship to yourself and delabelizing, destigmatizing your own self as an addict. If you look on my web, at Amazon, you have a list of my books, including Recover with an exclamation point. I have The Addiction Experience, which is something I wrote decades ago, which talks about how to understand the inner experience of addiction, what addiction does for people on an experience level. And I also have Addiction Proofing Your Family, which is a pamphlet for talking about raising children to be resistant to addiction in the world that we've just been discussing. So, Life Process Program, Recover, The Addiction Experience, Addiction Proofing Your Family, or that's just a brief pamphlet. I have a book called Addiction Proof Your Child. Those are 5 things that, could really get people oriented if they'd like to.
Well, Stanton, let me just end by saying you are forever a warrior of reason, and you're always pursuing what you know is right, despite even the most pervasive disagreements that we have, culturally or otherwise. And I always appreciate that about you, and I really thank you for speaking with me today.
And I want to thank you, Zach, for giving me, you're a little bit younger than I am. I'm 71 now. You, through this podcast, this is my second appearance, and you and I are talking about working, together, combining your work with young people and my outlook. You're giving me a whole boost in my, dare I call it, my old age. By the way, I just spent the weekend, Friday and Saturday, with my 9-year-old grandson. Me and him hang out a lot. So you, Zach, and my grandson Cassius Peele are keeping me energized and young.
Well, and you're providing me wisdom, so thanks so much for that.